So Julian is a sound consultant. He has given 5 TED Talks who have been viewed more than 20 million times. So if you don't know Julian, then you should go and check out his TED Talks. He has also written a book called Sound Business. He has written, amongst others, as communication expert for The Time magazine, The Economist, and The Times. He's also the founder and chairman of Sound Agency, so based in the UK. And when I read what his interests were, he wrote music and so forth. And then the last one was Italy. And when I read that, I am originally Italian, and I thought, wow, this has got to be a wonderful webinar already, because if you love Italy, then that's already very great. So, Julian, I will hand over the floor to you, and thank you very much again.
Adriana, and it's a joy to be here with you all. I'm going to talk about sound communication for the next 45 minutes or so, and then we'll take a few questions at the end. I believe we have to be finished by 6 p.m. your time, 5 p.m. my time. So I'm speaking to you from the UK. Sound communication is kind of what my life is about. I want to just give you some idea of what this affects in your life. And if you care about any of these things, then sound communication is important to you. And by sound communication, I mean speaking and listening. And I'll cover both of those 2 skills in this webinar. So these rather important things, actually, I can boil it down a little bit further to these 3 things. If you care about any of these things, then this webinar may well have something for you, and I hope something relatively transformative. Just by way of introduction, to back up what Adriana said, I run a company called the Sound Agency. That's my day job, and we work for some of the world's leading brands, asking and answering the question, how does your brand sound? And many brands have a great big brand book all about how their brand looks, and usually there are no pages at all about how it sounds, but it's important. Along the way, I did write a book, and we get covered a lot in the world's media, which tends to indicate to me that people find sound interesting, as do the viewing figures on my TED Talks, which are now up to about 30 million, actually. The top ones just come up to 9.5 million, I think, and is in the top 25 of all time. That one's about speaking. I'm going to cover quite a lot of that talk in this webinar this evening. This stuff comes from a training I've put together, which has come out of my 12 years of working with brands and looking at how they communicate in sound and how they're received, and thinking about how that plays out in our personal lives. So I've become very passionate about the skills of speaking and listening, sending and receiving, in effect. Now, this is the simplest possible model that you could have. And it's the way we tend to think of it. You know, we send, we talk, somebody listens. Simple as that, isn't it? Well, actually, it's not. It's more of a circular relationship where the way that we listen affects how somebody speaks to us. The way that we speak affects how somebody listens to us, and vice versa. The way somebody listens affects how we speak. The way somebody speaks affects how we listen. So there are circles going on all the time, and the 2 things are intimately related. Now let's start with listening. I love this quote from Ernest Hemingway. I absolutely agree with it. I think it's very true that anybody who listens really well has a big advantage in life, because most people simply don't. This is the first sound you ever heard. If you've got headphones on, you'll hear this very clearly. If you're listening through tiny speakers, it won't sound much. It's the sound of the human heartbeat, which was very loud in the womb, actually. And you were listening from 12 weeks after conception, before you really had any ears at all. Listening then with your whole body. You still do that now. Nevertheless, the ears are the primary organs for listening, and they're amazing things, you know, the human ears. When you start to look at the anatomy, those 3 little bones on the inside of your eardrum, one little membrane which decodes all of the richness of sound around you, those 3 little bones vibrating thousands of times a second from the moment they're formed till the moment you die. It's an amazing piece of engineering, if you like. Doesn't go wrong very often unless we abuse it. Now, we hear 10 octaves if we've got perfect hearing. You can see just 1 octave. The whole spectrum of visible light is 1 octave, from around 380 to 760 terahertz, very high frequency, just 1 octave. You hear a sphere all around you, but we see a cone in front of us, just a cone. Hearing is your primary warning sense. You know, if I want to warn you of something, I don't wave, I will shout. And that's why what we hear goes very deep, very fast. It's actually easier to upset people through their ears than through their eyes. Now let's talk about listening. We spend possibly 60% of our life listening to people, depending on what job and what kind of activities we're undertaking. And yet we're not that good at it. We retain just 1 word in 4 of what we hear. And that's pretty concerning, because if you think about it, and many of you will go on to high-paid jobs, I'm sure, if we're paying somebody £100,000 a year, we're paying them £60,000 a year to listen, because that's what they're doing with 60% of their time. And we're wasting about 45,000 because they're not listening. They're only picking up 1 word in 4. Now that's a bit disturbing. Almost half of many people's salary is being wasted because they're being paid not to listen, or to listen and to forget. Listening is a skill. I think it's an important skill. It's not the same as hearing. You hear everything. Listening is what you pay attention to effectively. It's a dying skill because we don't treat it seriously. Here are the 4 communication protocols. You've all been through education, and that has focused on your reading and writing. We test these things. We teach these things. I've presented the 4 here with equal weight, but that's not actually the way that we treat them in society. It's more like this. We don't teach speaking and listening very much at all in schools. We certainly don't test them. Listening is very much the forgotten skill, possibly because it's silent and it's so easy to miss. And people would think it's quite hard to test people on listening. Well, it's not that hard, actually. Let's have a look at listening. My definition is the meaning, making meaning from sound. So it's taking the totality of sound around you, selecting what you want to pay attention to, and then making it mean something to you. Now, the important thing to realize about listening is that your listening is unique. It's as unique as your fingerprints, actually. So every one of the people listening to this webinar has a unique listening. Why is this? Because we listen through a set of filters. Here they are. We're born into a culture. We speak a language, and that determines our listening for other people. We accrete beliefs, attitudes, and values along the way. We get them first from our parents, maybe, from role models, from friends, from teachers, and we select the ones that we want to internalize, and they become part of us. And they become filters through which we listen. Sometimes, to give you an example, it's very difficult to listen to somebody whose beliefs are diametrically opposed to ours. We can just dismiss that person as an idiot. So these act as filters, and they determine what we take on board and what we don't. In any given situation, we have expectations. We may have intentions going into a room, a conversation, a talk like this. And we have emotions which color our listening very much from moment to moment. Now, all of these things are unique to you. You've come a different road to sitting here right now, listening to this, to anybody else who's sitting on another computer listening to this. And that means that these filters determine your reality. They actually determine what you pay attention to. And after all, we don't experience the fullness of reality. It's all filtered, and then we have perception, which all happens in our head, in between our ears. So your reality is created by your listening filters. Now, let me give you an example of this. I'd like you to look at the screen and listen to what this guy is saying.
Ba, 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 ba.
Now, you're probably hearing da, da.
Ba, 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 ba.
Now, close your eyes and listen.
Ba, 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 ba.
He's actually saying ba-ba.
Ba-ba, ba-ba.
On the video, he's saying gaga. So your eyes see gaga, your ears hear ba-ba, and your brain says that's da-da. And you can't override that. If you looked at the screen again, you would hear da-da again. That's called the McGurk illusion. It's a cross-modal effect. It's one of the ways in which the senses interact and change one another. So we have to think about these things. Hearing is very important. It changes our reality. Now, I think there's a problem with listening, which is that in the modern age, we are actually in danger of losing it. Why? Well, first of all, we're just surrounded by terrible noise. We stand on street corners shouting over noise like this and pretending that it doesn't exist. So we get into the habit of suppressing sound. It's what we do with most of the sound around us. We suppress it and ignore it. And then, of course, we've invented ways of recording things. So just starting with writing and then sound recording and now video recording. Once upon a time, if you missed something, you missed it. All human knowledge was handed down orally. Now that's not the case. If you miss something, you can check it on YouTube or get the book, or somebody will catch you up in another way. So we've less reason to be that careful in our listening now. We've also become impatient. I love this cartoon. I think it's very true. The art of oratory in politics is dead. I don't know any politicians who practice oratory anymore. Pretty much they practice sound bites. They know that they can speak for about 10 or 20 seconds and then they'll get interrupted by somebody, maybe a journalist will interrupt them. So they've got very good at reducing everything to tiny little sound bites. And the media also desensitize us. These are some of the words that are used in the UK media a great deal. And I'm interested that you can only have two states in the UK these days. You can be okay or furious. Anytime anybody's mildly upset, it's always fury at. So once we dumb down emotions to these kind of polarized opposites, we lose all that subtlety, the gray in the middle. Also headphones. Now, if you can hear this noise standing next to somebody on a train, they're killing their hearing. And many of you probably use headphones. I do advise that you take care with them, because if you ran 100 decibels deep into your ear canals for hours a day, you are killing your hearing. It's like eroding ice from underneath. One day you'll go through and there's no going back. Your hearing will be destroyed. We are potentially raising an entire deaf generation. 1 in 6 American teenagers has noise-induced hearing loss as a result of headphone abuse. And noise-induced hearing loss is a serious issue, especially now with headphones. So you should be able to hear somebody talking pretty loud to you from a meter away over the top of your music. If you can't, then you're in trouble. And by the way, a tip for headphone use is get the best headphones you can possibly afford, because then you can have it quieter and it still sounds good. When we're using cheap headphones, the temptation is to keep turning it up. Headphones also have a social impact. We take big social spaces like this and turn them into millions of little sound bubbles like this. Now that's an issue, because in this scenario, nobody's listening to anybody. We're all listening to the soundtrack of our lives. And while I'm talking about technology, I'm sure none of you have ever sent or received this text message, but it does get sent, it does get received. This is not a conversation. And in fact, there's not a lot of real conversational listening that happens with technology. Much of the communication on things like Twitter and Facebook is personal broadcasting, isn't it? Personal broadcasting. Out. Me. I'm on a train. Who cares, really? And yet, this is what we put out into the world. There's not a lot of listening going on. By the way, if you're interested in that paradigm, there's a very interesting book by Sherry Turkle, who also did a great TED talk on it, called Alone Together, where she suggests that technology, far from bringing us together in some sort of global village, is actually driving us apart and leaving us separate. The image there is, two people sitting next to each other, both texting somebody else who's not there at all. So I think we are in danger of losing our listening. What can we do about it? Well, I have some ideas. I want to just mention the fact that nevertheless, although we're unconscious about sound, it does affect us in 4 powerful ways. So let me just mention to you the 4 powerful ways sound affects us, and then I'm going to give you 5 exercises to improve your conscious listening skills. Sorry about that. That's a shot of cortisol, your fight-flight hormone. Hope it didn't make you jump too far. If your alarm clock at home sounds anything like that, I do suggest you change it, because it's not good for you to wake up to a noise like that. We interpret sudden sounds as threats. That's genetic. That's over all of our evolution. It's the safest way to be. Let me calm you down again with some surf. This is roughly 12 cycles a minute, very similar to the breathing of a sleeping human being, and a sound we associate with being relaxed. Sound affects our heart rate, our breathing, our hormone secretions, even our brain waves. All our physical rhythms are entrained by the sound around us. Let's move on to the second way sound affects us, which is psychological. Music, of course, is the obvious example of this. This piece of music isn't going to make you feel happy. It wasn't designed to make you feel happy. Music is a very good conveyor of emotion. It's not the only sound that contains emotion or delivers emotional response. We've used birdsong a great deal at the Sound Agency because we've learned, all of us over hundreds of thousands of years again, that when the birds are singing, we're safe. Things are normally fine. It's only if something bad's going to happen, the birds suddenly stop. And if they do that, that's not a good moment, is it? We know something bad is coming. So that's the second way sound affects us. The third is cognitive.
If you're listening to this
understand
version
two
of me,
people
you're on the
talking
wrong
at the
track.
same time, or in this
Try
case,
listening
one
to the
person
other one.
talking twice. It's not possible. We have bandwidth for roughly 1.6 to 1.8 human conversations. So if you try and work in an environment that sounds like this, particularly if you can hear one person speaking next to you, it's incredibly hard to think. We all know that feeling. Shut up, I'm trying to think here. They're taking out one of your 1.6, leaving you with just 0.6 in your head to listen to the voice you need to listen to if you're doing knowledge work with numbers or with words. And this is the result.
If you're listening to this version of me,
the result is a massive drop in productivity, actually, roughly 66%. Now, the fourth way is behavioral. Of course it is. There's other things going on. So is this person going to drive at a steady 28 miles per hour, 35 kilometers per hour? I think not. We're all very familiar with the way that that kind of music can change our driving behavior. At the simplest, we will move away from unpleasant sound if we can. So if I were to put this on and leave it for the rest of this webinar, I don't think you'd be sitting here. You would leave. Of course you would. For people who can't get away from that kind of noise, the effects are devastating. Actually, we have something in the region of 3% of Europe's population having their sleep deprived night after night by traffic noise way above the World Health Organization recommended maximum. That's 8 million people who are being sleep deprived night after night. Now, this is where the Sound Agency does a lot of work, because retailers are just starting to realize that if they make a horrible noise, we leave. And if they make a nicer environment, we tend to stay longer, and we will spend more money if we stay longer. So it works for them and it works for us because it gives us a better environment to move around in. So we're transforming the sound, for example, of shopping malls all over Europe by removing noise and mindless music and replacing it with something rather more designed. In the same way you design the way a place looks with your eyes, we need to design the way places sound with our ears. Now, let me come on to those 8 exercises for improving your conscious listening skills. Here's the first one. Silence. We don't get much silence, most of us, especially if we live in cities. I think possibly Geneva is one of the quietest cities I've ever been to, with the exception of Venice, where there's no tire noise, of course. If you go to the center of Geneva, just by the cathedral, it's very, very quiet. You wouldn't know you're in a major capital city. However, most of us are besieged by noise a great deal of the time, and it's very important to get a few moments of silence every day. It recalibrates your ears, resets them, and allows you to listen afresh. So I do recommend just a few minutes of silence a few times a day. Try and get that. If you can't get absolute silence, then relative peace and quiet will do. Lock yourself in a toilet, a cupboard, a small room, anywhere where you can be undisturbed and just recalibrate yourself. So that's the first exercise. The second I call the mixer. And this is disentangling all of the sounds around you, thinking like a recording engineer would, with different channels, one sound on each channel. So how many channels am I listening to? For example, if I'm in a cafe like this, how do I disentangle those? It's very good at getting your acuteness, the quality of your listening better. Say, how many people am I actually hearing? How many cups? Where are all the separate sounds coming from? You can do it in a beautiful place like this as well. How many birds can I hear? Where are they? Which trees? That kind of thing. So that's the mixer as a good way of improving the acuteness of your listening. The third is savoring, like this guy is with his cup of coffee. And that's kind of unlocking the hidden choir in sounds around us. So this is my tumble dry, my old tumble dry at home, which had a faulty made of waltz. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And an American radio station put this nice bit of Mozart on top of it, creating a tumble dry waltz. Now, that tumble dryer made me happy for quite a long time because waltz time is inherently a happy time. It's the same as the human heart, if you think about it. Lub, dub, pause, lub, dub, pause, lub, dub, pause. The heartbeat is 3 time, it's a waltz. You can do this with other sounds as well. If you were to put your ear to the base of your kettle and turn it on, you might hear this. Now that's a beautiful and very rich and complex sound, I think. So there are many sounds around us which we can enjoy. And if we're savoring and really paying attention to sounds, we can also move away from the ones that are not so nice. Now let's move on to the fourth of the ways of improving your conscious listening. And this is to understand that you listen from a place. This is a metaphor. I'm not talking about a physical place. You can listen from different places, different psychological places, if you like. It's like, imagine there's a house on a hill. If you don't like the way it looks from here, go around the other side of the hill. Well, most people listen from one place they've occupied for the whole of their lives, and they think that's how you listen. You just do it. Well, actually, you can listen from many different places. I'll give you 6 examples as kind of scales. So at one end of this scale might be active listening, which is what's used a lot in the therapeutic professions. What I heard you say is ... And then you repeat exactly what the person said. At the other end of that scale might be passive listening, like a Zen master sitting by a stream, listening to the stream and absolutely not making it mean anything at all, just listening to the sound. Here's another scale. Critical listening, which is what you've been doing to me ever since I started, pretty much, evaluating, weighing up. You know, the editor, the little voice in your head that's saying, I didn't know that, or where did you get that from, or that's interesting. The little voice that just said, what little voice is he talking about? That little voice is your critic. And that is the way we listen a great deal of the time, in education, in business as well. Not always appropriate, though. Sometimes we might need to go onto the other person's island and feel their feelings, leaving them feeling understood, not just heard, but understood. It's said that in any human relationship, there are 3 things that we look for: to be heard, to be understood, and to be valued. Understanding and empathetic listening can be very, very powerful in relationships. And talking of relationships, I want to give you a slight gender stereotype here. Nevertheless, there's enough truth in it, I think, to make it valuable. Men tend to listen in a way I call reductive, which is to say for a point, for a solution to a problem. So you see these 2 guys on screen. He's saying, I've got this problem. He's saying, here's the solution. Thanks. That's a kind of typical male conversation in a nutshell. Women, on the other hand, tend to listen in a way I call expansive. You see these 2, heart to heart, eye to eye. In expansive listening, there is no point. It's not about a destination. It's about the journey. It's about being with the other person and just going where the conversation goes, not trying to solve a problem. Now, if you get these 2 things confused, it can cause problems in relationships. So, for example, she comes home and says, oh, I've had a dreadful day. This happened, this happened, this happened. He looks up from the football game and says, have a bath. You'll feel much better. Now, in the male world, that is problem solved, back to the football. In the female world, that wasn't quite what she was looking for. She was much more looking for, you poor thing, sit down, let me get you a cup of tea, tell me all about it. So we need to be aware that these different modes of listening can cause conflict if they're not applied correctly or if they're applied unconsciously. The 5th of the tools or exercises I suggest that you try on is rasa. And if you're in any of these roles, and you will be if you're not right now, I would include students in here as well, then this is very, very powerful. Rasa is the Sanskrit word for juice, actually. But in this context, it's an acronym which stands for receive, appreciate, summarize, ask. So receive is paying attention with your body. If you're listening to somebody, you look at them. So this is not listening. Yeah, I am listening to you. No, that's not listening. That's doing something else. Paying attention with your whole body, possibly leaning forward slightly, certainly looking at the person speaking, and possibly other little body language to show you're paying attention. Appreciate is little noises like, oh, really? That help the conversation to flow. Summarize is the word so. It's a very powerful word that's being sorely abused now in the world. Come from American tech speak, and it just gets stuck in at the beginning of every sentence when it's not meaningful. What's your name? So I'm John. No, I'm sorry, I don't see the logical sequence there. A, so B means A happened, and as a result of A, B happened. The name is not John just because I asked. So let's use the word so in the way it was designed to be used, which is to summarize things. It's its most powerful use. If you don't have a so person in a meeting, it can be a very long meeting. So what we've all said is this. We can now gather that up, move it aside, and get on to that. If you use the word so, you're summarizing what's been said. You can move the conversation along quite briskly. And then we have ask, asking questions at the beginning, in the middle, at the end. It's you can ask as many questions as you like. Now, I don't know if you've come across a thing called clean questions, but clean questions are quite useful. We tend to steer people with our questions. A clean question would be, what did you have for breakfast? And wait. The kind of question we tend to ask is, what did you have for breakfast? Did you have the cereal or the eggs? The eggs were really nice. And we're off steering somebody and actually not giving them a chance to respond in a clean way. Open-ended, clean questions are very powerful if you want to be somebody who understands other people and has influence in the world. The question why, possibly you need to be slightly more careful about than the others, where, what, who, which, and so forth. Why tends to get at people's motivations. It's a rather deeper question, I tend to think, especially if you say, why didn't you do that? Or why did you do that? It's a challenge sometimes. So we need to be a little bit sensitive about that, around that one, but questions overall can be very, very powerful. Now, total listening, something which you can practice starting now, costs nothing except for a little bit of attention and effort. Let me put to you that listening is an activity. It's not just something that happens. Total listening requires you to be conscious that you're doing something. I hope you're totally listening to me at the moment. And if you give somebody your full attention in this way, conscious that you're doing something, it's a rare gift. It really is. There are billions of people on this planet who've never been listened to properly. Committed. So that is giving somebody that full attention. I'm not going to be disturbed by anything else. Compassionate, seeking to understand the other person's perspective as best we can, and curious. We might find out something. We might learn something. Not knowing everything, not being a I know type of person. Now, here are some of the common errors that get in the way of listening. Getting distracted, daydreaming, we do that from time to time. Speech writing, which is trying to come up with the next brilliant thing so that while you're talking, actually, I'm not listening to you at all. I'm composing my next bit of witty dialogue. Being right, interrupting people. Interrupting is a modern menace. I hear it on the radio all the time with journalism now, and it drives me to distraction. People are very prone to interrupt each other. If that's you, do try just taking a deep breath before you say anything, and it'll just give you that little pause so that you don't ride straight into what somebody else is trying to say. People pleasing, that is saying yes when you mean no, saying no when you mean yes. We all tend to do it, but people tend to spot that, and it's not a tremendous way to listen, sort of being enthusiastic when actually you're absolutely disagreeing. And fixing, offering people unwanted solutions halfway through what they're saying when they just need to be listened to. Now, here are the major stumbling blocks to listening, apart from the errors that people tend to make. These things tend to get in our way. Semantics, I'm speaking English. Many of you are not native English speakers. And there may be words I've used which you have misunderstood. I don't know, maybe your English is very much in tune with mine, but it's very often the case if you're listening in a foreign language or to a foreign culture that we misinterpret things. And it may be the word that we both understand is said in different ways or means different things. Assumptions, really major issues can happen when I make assumptions about you. The biggest one would be you listen like I do. That is never true because you have a unique listening and so do I. And it is a grave mistake to assume that everybody listens like I do. Generalizations. Generalizations can be extremely dangerous when we take one instance and generalize it. It's a very good way to have a big argument often if you want to start making sweeping generalizations about somebody. And emotion. I would suggest there's an inverse relationship between emotion and listening. It tends to be that the more we listen to somebody, the less upset they become. Or the more upset we are, the harder it is to listen to somebody. So they tend to be inversely related. If you're having an argument, listening is a very good way to defuse it. So, to summarize some good practices in listening, here they are. Think about your filters. Have an intention in a conversation for yourself and for the other person, if you like. Decide on where you're going to listen from. Do the total listening, 4 C's. Compassionate, curious, committed, and whatever the other one was, which has gone out of my head right now. Use RASA, receive, appreciate, summarize, ask, and practice those other 3 techniques, the mixer, silence, and savoring. Committed was the other one, of course. Now let's move on to the sending part of the equation, because obviously we can become great listeners, and that's a great advantage in life. It's also a big advantage if we can speak with power. If you want to make a difference in the world, you may need to inspire people, lead people, persuade people, sell to people, enroll people in your ideas. And that's only going to happen by speaking it powerfully to them. Let me deal with 7 deadly sins, which are in my TED talk, and I'll just briefly go through these, and then we'll go into a couple of things in more detail. The first sin, and I'm not saying never do these things. I'm not saying if you do any of these things, nobody will listen to you. What I am saying is if they become habits, it will make you harder to listen to. So with that distinction, gossip. Gossip is speaking ill of people who are not present. It's quite seductive, but it is not a powerful way to speak, because people won't trust you if you do that a great deal. Judging, or actually I'm talking about condemning people. Do you know somebody who's very condemnatory, just dismisses people, judges them, finds fault everywhere? That's hard to listen to, and it's not very pleasant to be around somebody who's like that. They don't inspire people. Negativity, and it's very difficult to be around anybody who's inveterately negative. Is your favorite word no? And inveterately negative, I mean, the story I told in my TED talk is absolutely true. My mother was very negative in the last years of her life. I took in a newspaper and said, oh, look, it's October the 1st today. And she said, I know, isn't it dreadful? Well, if October the 1st is dreadful, what chance have we got? This is the kind of person where you'd say, oh, the sun's coming out, and they'd say, oh, it'll be raining again in a minute. It's just deflating to be around them. I wonder to what degree you are positive in your speaking. Complaining, the British national pastime, of course. Now, complaining is great. If something's wrong, you can fix it. Like if you're in a restaurant and they bring you the wrong dish or it's cold, complain by all means, but not about things you can't fix. Complaining about the weather, complaining about sporting results, complaining about the government. You get one opportunity in most countries every few years to fix that one. There's not much point complaining about it in the meantime. It's viral misery to complain about things we can't fix. Excuses, we've all met this guy. Most of us have been this guy. It wasn't my fault. I didn't, it's a lot cleaner to say, sorry, this is what I've put in place to make sure it never happens again. Move on. Exaggeration or outright lying. I'm sure none of you have ever claimed to have read a book that you haven't read, have you? Solzhenitsyn, oh yeah, he's really interesting, isn't he? We've all done that. It tends to be part of human nature. And if you watch, there's a great TED talk, I can't remember the name of the woman who gives it, about how to spot a liar. Pamela Mayer, actually, is the person who gave it, and how to spot a liar. And she has some startling statistics about the number of times we're lied to in a day, in an average day, just person to person. It's hundreds. And so we all do it, unfortunately. And somebody for whom this becomes a really major thing, it gets very hard to listen to them because we just don't trust them. And finally, dogma, my way or the highway, thumping the table, confusing opinions with facts. These are 2 different things. And it's very important to distinguish that. I have a proposition, which is that opinions really are better offered by request only. Would you like my opinion on that? No? Oh, we have to be prepared for that. We love to offer opinions at all times. And I grew up in a household where opinions and facts were conflated. That creates a lot of arguments if that's the case. Now, let me just suggest, and I've just used one of them, let me suggest a few small words that you might want to pay attention to, possibly avoid. Here's the first one. I can't think of a single good use of this word, a single profitable use of the word should. If I use it about myself, I'm beating myself up. If I use it about you, I'm being judgmental. You should really lose some weight. How's that to take? Not very nice. It tends to be a word that it has in it either guilt or judgment. And there are many, many formulations which are much more powerful than using this word. Here's another one, and I used it a moment ago. Just is a minimizer when used as an adverb. The adjective just is fantastic, means fair and honourable. The adverb just, I'll just have one. You know that one? Or she's just a secretary. That's demeaning somebody. Or let me give you an example in speaking. I'd just like to start by welcoming you to this webinar. Rewind. I'd like to start by welcoming you to this webinar. Now, which one of those was more powerful? Of course, the second one, because in the first one, the word just was minimizing and saying, I'm really sorry. Do you mind if I just do this thing? It's only little and I'm sure it will be okay. It's kind of apologizing for saying what you're saying. Subtle, but you will have more power if you remove that word most of the time. And here's another one that you can remove almost all the time. But I like you, but are you going to listen to the first part of that sentence? I don't think so. We're committed to customer service, but now I know you're going to do nothing for me. You can replace that word with and in almost every use, and it is a big improvement. I like you, and well, that goes much better, doesn't it? We are committed to customer service, and here's what the small thing we can do for you. Those two things don't become mutually exclusive. So just try, there you are, just. Try replacing but with and in all your emails and all your conversation, and you'll see it has a big effect. Now, there are 4 foundations of powerful speaking. They form a word that's easy to remember. The word is hail, which means to greet or acclaim enthusiastically. And what they stand for is honesty, by which I mean being clear and straight. And I would say these are my 4 foundations. I'm not proposing these are absolutely inviolable, but I hope they're useful to you. The A is authenticity, which means being yourself. The I is integrity, which means being your word. If you're somebody who, when you say it, it happens, then your words have power in the world. And the L is love, which means wishing people well. So that's necessary to temper the honesty. We don't want to be absolutely honest the whole time. My goodness, you look awful this morning. That doesn't need to be said. So hail, honest, authentic, with integrity and with love. If you stand on those 4 things, then your words will have power and weight. I want to finish, let me just check. Yes, I have a few minutes left and I'm probably just got enough time. I'm using the word just a lot there. I have just enough time. The temporal use, by the way, is okay. I've just arrived. I've just got enough time to go through your vocal toolbox. Now, you may not be aware you have a vocal toolbox. This amazing instrument that we all play is taken for granted. And we think we just pick up how to use it. We're not taught at school how to use it. Some of you may have had speaking, singing, drama, voice coaching. Wonderful. For those of you who have never done that, this might be quite useful. Let's start with posture. If you move your head right forward and say something right now, you'll find your voice goes extremely strange. In the same way, if you move your head right back, your voice goes extremely strange. You need your head to be on top of your shoulders so that your vocal cords are relaxed and lined up. And unfortunately, many of us sit doing email the whole time and we're making phone calls, maybe speaking in this rather strained way. So try to sit up and be everything stacked. If you're standing, everything stacked vertically, feet roughly shoulder width apart from men, or just with a phantom foot in the middle for women. And you will find it has a big effect on your voice. And of course, the voice is just breath. So breathing in, that's the fuel for your voice. If you're somebody who comes on the stage and feels a bit nervous like this, take a big, deep breath and it will calm your voice right down. It's the single biggest antidote to nerves. Breath is what comes out. Practice breathing with your stomach coming in and out. Put your hands on your stomach and breathe in and out and feel your stomach expand, not your chest, but your stomach. And you will start to get much more profound breathing going on. Register. We have 4 registers that we can use. Well, some of us can use. The highest is called whistle register. Well, that's Mariah Carey doing whistle register. I don't think you'll be using that one very much. The next one down is falsetto register. Falsetto is going up here into a different gear altogether. Again, not very useful if you want to speak in power, but it's used a great deal in music. For example, Chris Martin of Coldplay sings in falsetto a great deal. Many bands do. Nevertheless, as I say, not widely useful if you're going to be powerful. Yeah. Sorry, let me just come back and do those again because I just jumped the gun on the final. So give me a moment. Okay, so the register that we use most of the time is the modal register, which encompasses the head, the throat, and the chest. So you can move your voice in between those 3 things by concentrating on where it's coming from. Visualize where it's coming from. At the moment, I'm speaking from my head, from my nose largely, and now I'm speaking from my throat, and now I'm moving down into speak from the chest, and I'm sure you can hear the difference. So if you visualize your voice coming from those different places, you can practice moving it. We vote for politicians with deeper voices. So if you can speak in the chest register more, you'll find your words have more impact and your voice is taken more seriously. There is a 4th register. It's called vocal fry. It sounds like this. Yeah. And I used to say it's not often used. Sadly, it is used a great deal now, largely because of Valley speak coming from California, where people speak like this. Yeah, I'm really stoked about this. I'm really excited. It's great. You know, and it's not actually using your vocal cords at all as they're designed to be used. It's not very good for your vocal cords. I do advise if you get tempted to speak like that because you think it's cool, it's really not cool. You have this amazing instrument. Let's use all of it. And timbre. Now, we tend to prefer voices which are rich, dark, warm, smooth, sweet, pretty much like you'd describe a hot chocolate. If that's not you, no worries. You can get vocal coaching and change your timbre. The vocal coach will probably pin your lack of beautiful timbre down to posture or where you're projecting your voice from or breathing and give you techniques to overcome whatever it is that you're finding wrong with your voice. Most of it will be habit. Pace and pitch. We can change what we're saying by getting really excited and going really fast. It's very important to vary your pace in a talk, as I just did there. Pitch can indicate emotion without changing pace at all. Where did you leave my keys? Where did you leave my keys? So there's a different emotional impact depending on where I pitch it. Prosody is the sing-song of speech. Now, Andrea mentioned Italy at the beginning. The Italians are masters of prosody. Of course, everything's up and down in Italy, and less so in other cultures. For example, some of you may be from Scandinavia, and Scandinavian prosody tends to be a little bit more restrained. It tends to sound a little bored almost to other people. Yes, we're very excited about this project, you know, but it's just a question of culture, and we need to be sensitive to different cultures' prosodies, the way they sing song or don't. If you want to speak in power, it's very important to master prosody and not get trapped by repeating prosodies such as high-rising terminal, where we say every sentence as if it were a question. That's becoming extremely common these days. You know, now, you know, it was a question, but the previous 3 sentences were not. It's much more powerful to go down at the end of a sentence when you make a statement than it is to go up at the end of a sentence when you make a statement, because going up is asking for approval. There's a question that's being hidden there, which is, are you happy with this? Is this okay? Can I say this? So it is a slightly deferential way to speak. It's also repetitive, so you lose some of the power of prosody. So think about prosody, practice it. Volume, very important too. You can get really loud, or you can go very, very quiet indeed. And you can always be appropriate with your volume if you're conscious of it. And finally, silence, which I mentioned earlier, can be a friend in a talk. You can leave quite big gaps in a talk. And we are very prone to think we have to go and fill every moment. Even if you're doing a 3-minute talk, you don't have to gabble the whole way through. It's much more powerful to leave some gaps. It's the valleys and the mountains. Now, I want to leave you with one final thought, which is that you always speak into a listening. You know, I said at the beginning, everybody's listening is unique, and each crowd or group has a unique listening. So whether it's one person you're speaking to or 1,000, you can sense the listening simply by paying attention and asking yourself the question, what is the listening? It'll be different every time. And if you can listen to the listening, if you can spot the listening, then it makes you a much more powerful speaker. So we have a circle. The way we receive affects the way people send. The way we send affects the way people receive. The way people receive affects the way we send. And the way people send affects the way we receive. It's circular all the time. And if you become conscious of this circle, then you can improve the power of your communication enormously. So I want to say thank you very much for your attention. I hope this has been of use to all of you oikos people out there across the world. And I think now we're able to take questions. Is that right, Adriana?
Yes, please. We can take, I think, about 10 minutes of questions. So you can raise your hand. Here there's a button to do that. So Sagar, I see you're the first one, so go ahead.
Yeah, my question is, when you ask companies what does your brand sound like, I didn't get what the question is, or how will a person or how will a company or brand will respond to such a question?
Well, we don't ask them the question directly. We try to answer it for them, actually. So we have them ask it for themselves. How does our brand sound? And there are 8 expressions of a brand that we've identified in sound, which include soundscapes in spaces, such as corporate reception, offices, shops, showrooms, any retail spaces, any spaces which are branded. And then there's also music. The human voice is an important one. So we pay attention to every vocal interaction. You might, for example, only have vocal interactions with your utility or your bank on the telephone. Telephone sound is in itself a big one. There are trillions of dollars, I think, a year lost in revenues by systems that go press 1 for this, press 2 for that, designed by technical people, not marketing people. And people get very frustrated with those. We have an aging demographic in every country in the world, and old people in particular absolutely hate those systems. So they need to be much better designed than they currently are. So those are just some of the ways in which we look at or listen to the sound of a brand and attempt to give them guidelines which help them to be consistent in every touch point, including every sound point, if you like.
Okay. Vuzal, next.
First of all, Julian, thanks very much for the very interesting lecture, I would say. A question is, what would you advise to the people who is for public speakers? I mean, people who very often make some public speech.
Well, practice is the first thing. Practicing public speaking. And the more you practice something, the more comfortable you become with it. It's like riding a bike or driving a car. You know, the first time you do it, it's very scary. Later on, you're doing it almost unconsciously. These days, I could speak to an audience of 5,000 or 10,000 people without feeling too nervous. It's just practice. And if you want to practice, I would suggest you hook up with an organization perhaps like Toastmasters, or maybe around your locality, there might be meetup groups who get together to practice public speaking to each other. Getting a coach is a good thing as well. Somebody who's willing to listen to you and give you honest feedback. You can do that at home, just with a friend. And then when you come to have an actual talk, my strongest advice is to rehearse until you bleed. I mean, really, rehearse it until you know the content, so that there is absolutely no danger of forgetting it. That's the biggest fear that we usually have, walking on stage and forgetting our lines, if you like. So make sure you've got the right aids for you. It might be cards, it might be PowerPoint or Keynote, it might be something else, I would tend to advise against reading a script. Reading writing doesn't sound like speaking. So have bullet points by all means, but speak naturally to the people. And I suppose the biggest single thing is it's not about you, it's about them. So you're giving people a gift. If you go on stage and it's all about you, it's pretty poor. You need to go on stage and be giving a gift to people, connect with them, and then you will be very successful.
Thank you. Anyone else with questions? Nobody? Okay, your last chance if you have any questions. Okay, Wuzal, yeah.
I also would like to ask, like, what people who just really, really often lost the people often daydreaming. I mean, like when they listen, but they just go very fast, go to their thoughts and just forget about the person who is talking. Who is talking? What kind of advice you can give to that kind of people?
Are you talking about people, me giving advice to people who daydream, or me giving advice to people speaking to people who daydream?
No, I mean to the people who is daydreaming, like.
Okay, well, that comes back to what I said during the talk, which is that listening is an activity. If we dismiss listening, if we relegate it to some sort of natural behavior and we don't pay attention to it, then it's very easy for our attention to wander off, and we're thinking about what we're going to have for lunch, or what we had to do this afternoon, or what somebody said to us earlier. So the important thing is to be conscious. And really, if you want to pin all my work down, the work on speaking, the work on listening, the work on designing sound, it's all about consciousness. It's about awareness and mindfulness. So this is a conversation about becoming more conscious in your life. And it's a very good practice, if you're listening to somebody, to be conscious of the fact that you're listening. So it's not unconscious. And then you can actually watch yourself listening. And that means paying full attention. You remember I gave you the 4 C's. So you need to be conscious, committed, compassionate, and curious. Those 4 things.
Okay, we have 2 last questions. So the first one by Lancelot.
I think it's the same as Sagar. Is how do you implement this advices in the companies, for companies? I think it's the same as Sagar, I'm not sure.
Well, this is a slightly different level to the level that we work on with companies. We audit companies in the first place. So we go out and listen to spaces or to brands, and we come back and tell them how they are, what kind of noise they are making, what kind of sound they are making, and what kind of effect it's having because of our scientific model of the way sound affects human beings. So we audit first, and then we turn it around the other way and we say, if you want to have this effect, then in this situation, this is the kind of sound you need to be making in all the touch points. So we'll be looking at every way they make sound and giving them advice. These days, most of it is about sound in spaces. So I spend a great deal of my time, sadly, in shopping malls, airports and places like that, listening, auditing, and giving advice about how to improve the soundscapes.
Clear, Lancelot?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, wonderful. And the final question was by Otman. Please unmute yourself. Otman, can you, or Adriana, can you, okay, yeah, there you go.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so thanks for your advice. And how? What about gestures while talking? Any advice? Any mistakes can we avoid?
Mistakes with what?
Gestures.
About
gestures. Oh, gestures. Yes, absolutely. Well, there are a couple of gestures which I would avoid. One of the biggest ones, and I don't know if you can see this, is people who talk with their hands open like this the whole time, normally at waist level. And that gesture is called the placator. It's an archetypal gesture, and it's a begging gesture. It means don't hurt me, I have no weapons, or it means please. I've seen people give entire, quite passionate talks with their hands in this position. Now, if you're saying please give generously, that's an appropriate gesture. But if you're saying we've got to do something about this, then you're undermining the power of what you're saying by begging. If you like to have your hands out in front, just turn them vertically like this. You'll see a lot of politicians who speak like this a great deal of the time, just waving their hands about meaninglessly in front of them, but not flat. So try and avoid that one. Also, I would avoid this. That's called the blamer, and that's a pretty powerful gesture. You've got to be pretty strong if you're saying something like that. You're blaming people. Actually, Bill Clinton used to speak like that, and they softened him off, and now he does this. It's a lot less categorical. So there are gestures. I would say anything that's unconscious and meaningless in the context of your talk. If you're talking about being on stage and giving a speech, every part of it needs to be conscious. Your every movement, the way you stand and the way you gesture, really need to be conscious, so they all work together. If you're somebody who gesticulates the whole time and you're doing this all the time, it may not go with what you're saying. So just think about it. Get somebody to coach you. Get somebody to look at the way you're gesticulating. Some of us also are very restricted in our gestures. You know, we'll be like this, all hunched up, and it feels restricted. So the best way to do this is to get a coach, to get a friend to watch you speak and give you feedback on everything and how it's affecting them.
Great. I think that answered your question, Adnan. So we are running out of time. So we really would like to thank you very much, Julian. We can do a virtual applause to Julian. Wonderful. And we thank you very much for having been part of this journey with us, and we hope to definitely keep in touch with you in the future. And to everybody else, see you at the next webinar. Thank you very much for having joined us, and have a great evening ahead. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Thanks, Anita.
Thank you, Julian.